also. So thank you so much for joining us today for our chat on Human Trafficking Awareness Month. My name is Hillary Vandenberg. I am a gender violence prevention specialist here at OPDB in the Sexual Assault Prevention Program and Policy Unit. I am so excited to be joined by CJ Boykin from DCJS, the Department of Criminal Justice Services. CJ is the Director of Human Trafficking Prevention at DCJS. He is a former county, state, and federal prosecutor and has served as law clerk to New York State Court of Appeals judges, the late George Bundy Smith and the late Fritz W. Alexander II. CJ has a bachelor's in psychology from Colgate University, a master's of education from SUNY at Buffalo, and a Juris Doctorate from Cornell University Law School. So without further ado, welcome CJ. Can you tell us a little bit more about your role on the New York State Human Trafficking Task Force?
Yes, the New York State Interagency Task Force on Human Trafficking has 10 state agencies. 2 are OTDA, the Office of Temporary Disability Assistance, and the Division of Criminal Justice Services, of which I'm a part, and I'm the designee for DCJS. There are 8 others: the Office of Mental Health, the Department of Health, the Department of Labor, the Office of Children and Family Services, the Office of Victim Services, the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, the Office of Addiction Supports and Services, and the New York State Police. So those 10 agencies, pardon me?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Those 10 agencies comprise the ITF. Also, there are other agencies who are basically part of the task force, like the Department of State, who aren't designated by statute, but through the actions of the body involve them as members. And so as the co-chairs of the ITF, I'm the designee for DCJS, and in that role, I help to designate or determine strategies and goals for the ITF. We work on projects like training and model policies for human trafficking. We also work to provide presenters to give us cutting edge practices on what's going on in human trafficking nationwide. And we coordinate throughout the state to help with human trafficking victims and providing services for them.
Okay, awesome. Sounds like some exciting work is happening. Can you tell me about the prevalence of human trafficking in New York or the United States more broadly?
There recently signed 2 amendments to the New York State Human Trafficking Statutes. And in comments to those amendments, it was noted that human trafficking continues to be a major problem nationwide and in New York State. Human trafficking is perceived to be vastly underreported. Roughly 10 years ago, human trafficking was 3rd as a commercial criminal activity behind #1 drugs and #2 guns. Since then, human trafficking has surpassed guns and is now directly behind drugs. It is the fastest growing criminal enterprise presently. Additionally, labor trafficking is deemed to be pretty much vastly underreported. Its detection is much more difficult for law enforcement than sex trafficking. Presently, prostitution is illegal in New York State, and with prostitution, law enforcement is much more prone to detect sex crimes like prostitution, other sex offenses. So those are much more amenable to law enforcement detection. Whereas when it comes to labor trafficking, a lot of labor trafficking activities on their face are purely legal. Agriculture, dairy work, those kinds of things. So human trafficking is very prevalent and probably much more so than we realize because how labor trafficking is masked.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important to talk about because when I think human trafficking, I think Taken, the movie about sex trafficking internationally, it's not something that happens here at home and that kind of thing. But when we do think about trafficking, we think almost exclusively, at least in like culturally, of sex trafficking. And we so often forget to talk about labor trafficking. Are there any other stereotypes around human trafficking that we should be aware of?
Well, you mentioned the movie Taken, and things like that do sort of skew the perception of trafficking, I believe, worldwide. People think about those types of things. Whenever I encounter people who are questioning about human trafficking, that's the first thing they think. Well, this doesn't happen here. And if it does happen, it happens in much more metropolitan areas. It does happen in a large percentage in metropolitan areas, but it happens much more so frequently in rural areas. I was asked recently to do a presentation on what rural trafficking would look like. And I made very clear that the rural versus metropolitan divide is basically artificial. One of the cases involving someone who was prosecuted for trafficking in Amsterdam, New York, which is only 20 minutes or so from here, that trafficker met his victim. The victim was a runaway from Pennsylvania. He met her in Manhattan, brought her upstate, and trafficked her in the Albany area, and then actually had her assaulted in Montgomery County. So it's very common for trafficking. If there were arrows pointing to where trafficking occurred and where it originated from, they'd be all interconnected. So don't be misled by the perception that trafficking doesn't happen in rural areas. But myths involve what we have to remember is, like I mentioned earlier, is that it happens in areas like with agriculture, dairy production, people working in restaurants, people working in construction. And so people think that, well, this guy's getting paid for his labor, he can't be trafficked. Well, yes, he can. Even though a person is getting pay, even full pay, he could still be under the pressures of a trafficker. And especially when it comes to those who are undocumented, people think that, well, he's here illegally, he can't be properly considered as a trafficked person, but that happens all the time. People think that because someone's involved in prostitution that they can't be a trafficking victim. Yes, they can, even if they're being paid for their prostitution. And what some traffickers do, some pimps may convince someone who's prostituting for them, well, look, what I want you to do is you sell this guy, this John, you sell him drugs in addition to performing sexual services. And he has the person in prostitution do that, and she thinks, okay, he's having me do this. Now, after he's forced her to do that, she sold drugs. Now he convinces her that she can't go to law enforcement because she sold drugs to this guy, in addition to providing sexual services. So those are kind of misconceptions, stereotypes that surround the whole arena of human trafficking. Also, you don't have to be moved anywhere. You talk about someone being picked up and kidnapped and dragged off to another country. You can be trafficked from your own home.
Absolutely. Those things are so important to remember, and to remember the overlap between things like undocumented status, of activities that you might be engaged in willfully, but overlapping with your status as a victim of human trafficking. So what are some of the tactics of coercive control that traffickers use?
Well, these guys, they're expert manipulators. They know how to manipulate people. They'll tell someone, hey, I'm in love with you. I'll marry you. I'll provide you legal status, which is all in violation of New York State statutes. And they'll do this in an effort to coerce them into providing commercial sex or work. Some traffickers intentionally impregnate their victims so they can use the children who are born of that union as something to bargain with. They'll say, I'll tell the family court that you're involved in prostitution. And when that happens, they're going to take this child from you. You lose custody. And of course, the victims don't want that. They'll say things like, oh, I just need this one favor from you. If you love me, you provide this sexual activity at this time, just this one time, do this for me so we can make the rent or mortgage or whatever. And then what the victim finds is that that behavior proliferates into basically the daily life of that person. And so that's what they do. A trafficker may tell a worker, look, I know I owe you $1,200 for the work you perform for me, but if you don't continue working, I won't be able to pay you at all. And additionally, you and I both know I can have you deported whenever I want to. So they'll use that to hold over the victim's head.
Yeah, that really resonates with me and the work that OPDB does on domestic violence, because you touched on things like reproductive coercion and using children, right, to maintain that power and control over the person that is being trafficked or is being abused. And likewise, you know, using someone's legal status and using financial abuse to keep a person trapped under the thumb of an abusive partner or a trafficker. So that really resonates with the work that we're doing. So what signs should we look for to identify a victim of human trafficking? If this is happening in our own backyard, what can the public kind of be aware of as potential signs of a victim of human trafficking?
Well, when it comes to sex trafficking, I mean, trust your judgment. Sometimes if you're in a hotel, you see a person hanging around, they look uncomfortable. You know, you see a young person scantily clad late at night in a, you know, sort of a red light district area. What are they doing there? Why are they hanging around this hotel? Some of them may have tattoos. Some may be behaving in a very sort of furtive manner, looking up to someone who seems to be in control of the situation, those kinds of things. A lot of these victims have been runaways, and runaways are especially vulnerable to trafficking. They may be, they look like they're exhausted. They may look like they're afraid of someone. There are a lot of different things that may show that the person is subject to someone else. Now, I've had people say to me, or say, well, you know, I've seen that person. Look at those persons on that track. And a track is a place where you'll see people walking up and down the street, sort of advertising for prostitution. They'll say, I don't see a gun to that person's head. You know, why should I think that this person isn't doing this on their own volition? Well, there could be a lot of reasons behind that. Like we mentioned earlier, the coercive techniques. So sometimes these people might not know where they are. They're living in Albany County, but over the weekend, they find themselves in Virginia, in DC. How do they get there? Why are they at these hotels? They don't know their surroundings. They're not familiar with where they are. You encounter someone who's plopped in the middle of the city, but they don't really know anything about it. They don't know where they are. They're basically doing the bidding of someone else. So also evidence of a controlling, a dominating relationship. You might notice that this woman walking up and down the street, but every once in a while, this car stops by and it seems that she totally changes her demeanor when this person approaches her. So those are kinds of things that you can sort of help you detect what's going on when it comes to trafficking.
Yeah, one of the things that resonated in earlier conversations with you was that somebody might not be dressed appropriately for the weather, right? Like, and I think for me, that speaks to like labor trafficking, that if it's, you know, 6 degrees out and stuff, but somebody is working in like, you know, a t-shirt and some thin pants and no boots or anything, like that might be something else to kind of be a clue. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. And when it comes to that, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center puts out a number of identifiers that you can find in a healthcare setting to help you detect what a person who may be trafficked. But things like when you see a person, the way she's walking in her clothes, does she seem comfortable in those shoes? Does that outfit fit the demeanor of the person? those kinds of things. So let your intuition, your gut sort of guide you sometimes. And you say, I've seen this picture, something doesn't look right. She's saying this, but everything about her is saying something else. So yeah, those kinds of things that, despite what the person may say, can give you a clue as to where the person's headed.
Absolutely. Yeah, and just want to plug for people, humantraffickinghotline.org, which has a lot of great resources for identifying potential victims of human trafficking. So tell me more about what New York State is doing around human trafficking.
Like I mentioned earlier, our state's Interagency Task Force on Human Trafficking. There are a number of task forces statewide. We participate in them. OTDA also participates in them. The Department of Labor participates in them. Those task forces include local, state, and federal law enforcement and service providers, and sometimes faith-based institutions who help provide victims with assistance. There's prosecution, which is a great thing to happen when we can have it, but some victims aren't willing to come forward to law enforcement. So in the meantime, it's good to be able to provide services for them, even if they aren't going to participate or help with an investigation or with law enforcement. But part of these connections that we make between the state interagency task force and the local ones, there are some more local task forces that are federally funded. And part of the impact of those is that they allow us to make connections statewide for victims. For example, I might get a call on Tuesday afternoon saying, hey, we have this person here in Hudson. Is there a way we can have that person transported from Hudson to the western part of the state? And then phone calls will be made, and those kinds of connections we made to help facilitate those types of things. We've received phone calls from the New York State Police because they were appreciative of getting their victims confirmed as confirmed victims of human trafficking under our state program, because those confirmations allowed them to prepare those victims to testify in a case against a trafficker. And the state police contacted us back to say, hey, thanks for that. We were allowed to provide services for them, get them ready for trial. And after the conviction, those two victims have now been able to thrive. So those kinds of things come back to us, that the interconnectedness of these agencies really helps work in the fight against trafficking overall.
That's amazing. And so thank you for sharing that with us. I think that that's so important to stress, is that you are still entitled to services no matter what else you might be wrapped up in. You're still entitled to services if you're experiencing trafficking. So I wanted to just bring up that recently Governor Hochul has signed an amendment to the START Act, which allows victims of human trafficking, survivors of human trafficking, to have their criminal convictions vacated if their crime was as a result of trafficking. And so that used to be just exclusively for sex work related crimes or convictions. And now it's expanded more broadly to help protect victims of human trafficking even further, and kind of, hopefully let them thrive and start fresh by having those convictions vacated when it was a direct result of their experience of trafficking. So yeah, is there any other resources that you want to plug for us that New York has, or that might be available nationally, that our viewers should be aware of?
Well, our victim confirmation process, and that's for law enforcement and social/legal service providers who encounter a victim who they think reasonably appears to be a victim of human trafficking. That's a fairly broad and low threshold for a person to meet. And so if that person meets that status, then they'll be entitled, number one, to have those convictions vacated, like you talked about also. But there's also our social services law that governs the services that they would be provided, which are including, but not limited to, case management, emergency temporary housing, healthcare, mental health counseling, drug addiction screening and treatment, language instruction, job training and placement assistance, services to assist in establishing residency in New York State or the US, and others. So we like the program because it helps victims, even if they don't want to participate in an investigation or a prosecution. And you'd be surprised that, you know, the number of these victims will come forth and say, hey, I'm a human trafficking victim. And a lot of them are sort of somewhat intimidated by law enforcement. So our program sort of stands alone and allows the victim to receive the services without the requirement of whatever they may feel about law enforcement in general.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, CJ, for joining us so that way we can all learn more about human trafficking that's happening around us and what New York State is doing to combat this issue. So thank you so much for joining us. We so appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thank you for having us. Our pleasure. Thank you.